What if I told you that a sitting president was once arrested for running over a woman with his horse, that another kept a mockingbird that ate food from his lips, and that one president's parrot had to be removed from his funeral because it wouldn't stop cursing? Yeah, American history is weird. These are the stories they don't tell you in school. The ones that make presidents seem less like historical figures and more like actual human beings who made deeply questionable decisions about pet alligators and mechanical exercise horses. So here's what we're doing. Over the next 2 hours, I'm going to tell you one strange, verified, and oddly fascinating fact about every single US president. From George Washington's rum-spiked morning coffee all the way to Joe Biden's 36 years of train commutes. Before we start, if you enjoy falling asleep to weird history delivered in a vaguely sarcastic monotone, go ahead and subscribe. Hit the like button if you're still conscious enough to find it. And if you somehow make it through all 45 presidents without falling asleep, impressive. Concerning, but impressive. Starting with a man who thought 3 shots of rum was an appropriate breakfast beverage. George Washington, as you probably know, was the first president of the United States. Wooden teeth, cherry tree, crossing the Delaware, all that. What they don't usually mention in the textbooks is that the man started his mornings with coffee spiked with 3 shots of rum. Not a delicate splash. 3 full shots. He called it Fish House Punch Light, which implies there was a heavier version somewhere. And honestly, I don't want to know what that looked like. This wasn't some occasional weekend treat either. This was his regular morning routine. Imagine showing up to lead a fledgling nation with that kind of fuel in your system. The Constitutional Convention suddenly makes a lot more sense, doesn't it? But Washington wasn't the only founding father with peculiar habits. Our second president had a secret he kept locked away in code. John Adams was a meticulous man. Lawyer, diplomat, vice president, then president. He kept detailed diaries throughout his entire life, documenting everything from political machinations to what he ate for dinner. Except here's the thing. He wrote large portions of his diary in shorthand code, his own personal cipher. And to this day, historians still can't fully decode all of it. There are passages we'll simply never understand because Adams decided certain thoughts were too private, even for a diary hidden in his desk drawer. What was he writing about? We don't know, probably never will. It's the 18th century equivalent of password protecting your journal with a code nobody else has, except the password died with you in 1826. It's both paranoid and oddly relatable. But if you think a coded diary is obsessive, wait until you hear about shopping lists. Thomas Jefferson gets credit for the Louisiana Purchase and writing the Declaration of Independence, but let's talk about his organizational skills. When he sent Meriwether Lewis off to explore the newly purchased Western Territory, Jefferson didn't just say, "Good luck, bring back maps." No. He sent Lewis a 58-page shopping list. 58 pages for a camping trip. The list included portable soup, which sounds like something from a dystopian novel, 15 rifles, several scientific instruments Jefferson himself had tested, and detailed instructions on botanical specimen collection. Lewis probably read this list and wondered if he could just stay home. Jefferson had opinions about everything, down to what type of ink they should pack. It's the kind of micromanagement that would get you passive-aggressive emails in a modern office. But Jefferson had other peculiarities beyond his list-making tendencies. He also had an unusual companion in the White House. Jefferson kept a pet mockingbird named Dick. Not particularly creative naming, but there it is. Dick the mockingbird lived in the White House and had free range of Jefferson's study. The bird would perch on Jefferson's shoulder while he worked, sometimes for hours, occasionally singing, occasionally just watching the President of the United States draft correspondence with France. Guests reported that Dick would fly around the room during meetings, which must have been distracting during important diplomatic discussions. Jefferson allegedly taught the bird to take food from his lips, which is either charming or slightly concerning, depending on your feelings about bird hygiene. Dick lived a good long life for a mockingbird, and when he died, Jefferson was genuinely distraught. The man wrote pages about grief and loss in his journal, presumably in regular English this time, but not every presidential relationship with staff members was quite so peaceful. James Monroe was generally known as a calm, diplomatic person. Era of good feelings and all that, but in 1820 something snapped. His Secretary of Treasury, William Crawford, disagreed with Monroe about some appointment or policy. The details are fuzzy, and the disagreement escalated. Escalated how, you ask? Monroe chased Crawford out of the White House with fire tongs. Actual fire tongs, the metal kind you use to adjust logs in a fireplace. Picture that scene. The President of the United States, in his 50s, sprinting through the halls of the White House, brandishing fire tongs like a medieval weapon, while his Treasury Secretary runs for his life. They apparently resolved the dispute later, very professionally, I'm sure, but that moment existed. That happened in American history. And somehow Crawford kept his job. But if you think that's the strangest pursuit involving a president, wait until you hear about involuntary interviews. John Quincy Adams had a morning routine. Every day, weather permitting, he would walk down to the Potomac River and swim. Completely naked. This was the 1820s, so it's not like there were designated swimming areas or bathing suits. You just swam. Adams enjoyed his solitary morning swims, probably thinking deep thoughts about foreign policy or whatever. Then one morning, a journalist named Anne Royal figured out his schedule. She wanted an interview. Adams had been avoiding her requests. So, Royal walked down to the Potomac, found Adams' clothes on the riverbank, and sat on them. Just sat there. Adams had to either swim indefinitely or talk to her. He chose the interview. Conducted the whole thing from the water while Royal asked him questions from the shore. Sitting on his presidential clothing, it's arguably the most aggressive interview tactic in American journalism history, and it worked. But Adams was positively dignified compared to what comes next. Andrew Jackson owned a parrot, an African gray parrot, specifically named Polk. Jackson loved this bird, talked to it constantly, and apparently Jackson's vocabulary around the parrot was, shall we say, colorful. Polk learned to swear. Extensively. In multiple languages, according to some accounts. When Jackson died in 1845, they held his funeral at his home, the Hermitage. Family, friends, dignitaries, all gathered to pay respects, and Polk was there. The parrot apparently started cursing so loudly and so profanely during the funeral service that they had to remove the bird from the premises. A reverend who was there wrote about it later, noting that the parrot's language was unfit for polite company, which is Presbyterian code for absolutely vile. Jackson would have loved it. The man fought over 100 duels and openly defied the Supreme Court. Having his parrot cursed out at his funeral feels very on brand. But not everyone left such a loud legacy. Martin Van Buren wrote an autobiography, published it after his presidency, hoping to cement his historical legacy. The book is over 700 pages long. It covers his childhood in Kinderhook, New York, his legal career, his time as governor, as senator, as vice president, and president. He wrote about Andrew Jackson, about the Panic of 1837, about the political battles that defined his career. He wrote about almost everything, actually. Except one thing. His wife. Hannah Van Buren died in 1819, years before he became president. They were married for 12 years, had 4 sons together, and Van Buren's autobiography doesn't mention her once. Not her name, not their marriage, nothing. It's one of history's stranger omissions. Historians still debate whether it was grief, social convention, or something else entirely. We'll never really know, but at least Van Buren lived long enough to write that autobiography, unlike the next president. William Henry Harrison wanted to prove something at his inauguration. He was 68 years old, the oldest president elected at that point, and critics said he was too old and frail for the job. So on March 4th, 1841, Harrison stood outside in freezing rain with no coat and delivered a speech. A 2-hour speech, the longest inaugural address in American history, clocking in at 8,445 words. He talked about Rome, he talked about constitutional principles, he talked about executive power. He stood there in the cold rain for 2 hours, reading from page after page, while everyone around him slowly developed hypothermia. Harrison caught pneumonia. He died exactly 31 days later, never having really served as president at all. The speech meant to prove his strength ended up being the thing that killed him, which is irony so thick you could cut it with a knife. But if Harrison's tenure was brief, the next president made up for it with remarkable longevity. John Tyler had 15 children. 15. 8 with his first wife, Letitia, who died while he was president. Then 7 more with his second wife, Julia, whom he married when he was 54 and she was 23. Tyler was 63 when his last child was born. His children's births spanned from 1815 to 1860, which is 45 years. Some of his kids had kids who lived into the 21st century. As of recent years, Tyler still had living grandchildren, not great-grandchildren, grandchildren, born in the 1920s. The math barely works, but it does work. Tyler's genetic legacy is arguably more impressive than his political one, and that's really saying something. The man was expelled from his own political party while president, a feat very few have managed. But despite fathering a small village worth of children, Tyler kept a surprisingly strict household. Which brings us to the next administration's ideas about proper behavior. James K. Polk was intensely serious about his presidency. He worked himself nearly to death, literally. The man barely slept, constantly strategized about territorial expansion, and had very specific ideas about appropriate White House conduct. Polk banned dancing and card playing in the White House, completely. His wife, Sarah, supported this wholeheartedly. No waltzes, no poker, nothing. State dinners at the Polk White House were famously somber affairs. Guests would stand around making awkward small talk, eating their food, and then leaving as quickly as possible. Washington society found it stifling. Even political allies privately complained. But Polk didn't care. He thought the White House should be a place of serious business, not frivolous entertainment. He served one term, accomplished basically all his stated goals, then died 3 months after leaving office, probably from exhaustion. The man lived what he preached, I'll give him that. But the next president had a very different approach to personal presentation. Zachary Taylor earned the nickname Old Rough and Ready during his military career, and he earned it honestly. The man didn't care about appearance. He wore old, worn-out uniforms in battle, sat casually during conflicts, and, according to multiple accounts, he once sat on a cannonball during a battle. Just sat down on an actual cannonball like it was a chair while artillery fired around him and soldiers ran everywhere. Whether this was bravery, indifference, or just a lack of other seating options, nobody's quite sure. Probably a mix of all three. Taylor's whole vibe was aggressively unbothered by danger. He brought that same energy to the presidency, showing up to his inauguration in plain clothes while everyone else wore formal attire. Taylor died 16 months into his term, possibly from cholera, possibly from eating too many cherries and drinking cold milk at a 4th of July celebration, which sounds made up but appears in multiple historical accounts. But his successor had different priorities, specifically regarding indoor plumbing. Millard Fillmore installed the first bathtub in the White House in 1851. Now, people had been living in the White House for over 50 years at this point. Presidents just bathed in portable tubs that servants filled with water, then emptied. Fillmore looked at this system and thought, no, we can do better. So he had a permanent bathtub installed with actual plumbing. It was a big metal tub connected to the White House water system, such as it was. Fillmore was apparently very proud of this bathtub, showed it to visitors. This was cutting-edge technology in 1851, understand. Indoor plumbing was still rare. Most Americans still used outhouses. So Fillmore's bathtub was genuinely impressive at the time, even if it seems mundane now. It's a humble legacy, but it's something. Fillmore himself called his presidency unremarkable, which is honest if nothing else. But at least Fillmore never got arrested while in office, unlike the next president. Franklin Pierce was arrested while serving as President of the United States, 1853. Pierce was riding his horse through the streets of Washington, D.C., and he ran over a woman. Accidentally, presumably, but he definitely hit her with his horse. A police officer witnessed the whole thing and arrested the president on the spot for reckless riding. Pierce was taken into custody. The woman survived with minor injuries. The case was eventually dismissed, probably because prosecuting a sitting president for a traffic accident seemed complicated, legally speaking. But for a brief moment, Franklin Pierce was under arrest. He's the only president that happened to, at least that we know of. Pierce's presidency was otherwise unremarkable, except for being widely considered one of the worst in history. The man drank heavily in office, which didn't help. But his successor had different problems, specifically involving White House wildlife. James Buchanan kept a pet bald eagle at the White House. Someone gave it to him as a gift because apparently that was a thing people did in the 1850s, just casually gifting the president large birds of prey. The eagle lived on the White House grounds, and Buchanan was quite fond of it. Until one day, the eagle escaped, just flew away. They searched for it, never found it. The eagle was gone. Somewhere in Washington, D.C. in 1859, there was a presidential eagle just living its best life, probably terrorizing local wildlife and confusing ornithologists. Buchanan never got another pet after that. He's also the only president who never married, which has led to endless historical speculation, but that's another story. The eagle incident feels like a metaphor for his presidency, honestly. Things just flying away, never to return, while Buchanan watched helplessly. But the next president kept his important documents much more secure. Abraham Lincoln kept his important papers in his hat. His iconic tall stovepipe hat wasn't just a fashion statement, it was a filing system. Lincoln would fold up documents, letters, notes, and just stuff them inside his hat. When he needed something, he'd take off his hat and rummage around until he found it. This was the President of the United States during the Civil War, mind you. Military orders, legislative drafts, all living in a hat. There's something deeply charming about this. The idea that Lincoln's organizational system was just put it in the hat. It apparently worked for him. He never lost anything important, as far as we know. The hat was tall enough to hold quite a bit of paper, to be fair. And it's not like he had a briefcase. This was 1861. The hat filing system was actually pretty practical, in a weird way. But Lincoln's successor had organizational problems of a very different nature. Andrew Johnson showed up drunk to his own vice presidential inauguration, March 4th, 1865. Johnson had been sick with typhoid fever, still recovering. Someone suggested he have some whiskey to steady himself before the ceremony. Johnson apparently took this advice very seriously and drank quite a bit of whiskey. Then he gave a 17-minute rambling speech in the Senate chamber that made absolutely no sense. He slurred his words, went off on tangents about his humble origins, offended several senators. Lincoln, sitting nearby, reportedly looked mortified. Newspapers the next day were brutal. Johnson later claimed he'd never been drunk before and never would be again, which nobody really believed. 6 weeks later, Lincoln was assassinated, and Johnson became president, which must have been a sobering experience in multiple senses of the word. But at least Johnson never got in trouble with law enforcement, unlike the next president. Ulysses S. Grant was pulled over and fined for speeding. In 1872, in a horse-drawn carriage, Grant liked to drive his carriage fast through the streets of Washington, D.C., which was illegal. A police officer named William West saw the president flying through the intersection at an unsafe speed and pulled him over. Grant apparently knew he was guilty and handed over a $20 fine without argument. The officer wrote him a ticket, and Grant paid it. The next day, Grant allegedly sent the officer a box of cigars as an apology, though this part might be embellished. Grant was surprisingly humble for someone who'd won the Civil War. He later said the officer was just doing his job and doing it well. It's perhaps the most respectful presidential interaction with law enforcement in American history. But Grant's successor had very different ideas about appropriate behavior, specifically regarding alcohol. Rutherford B. Hayes banned all alcohol from the White House completely. His wife, Lucy, supported this so strongly that the press nicknamed her Lemonade Lucy. No wine at state dinners, no champagne at receptions, nothing. Just lemonade, coffee, and water. Washington society was horrified. Foreign diplomats complained to their home countries about the dry dinners, but Hayes and Lucy didn't budge. They were both deeply religious and believed alcohol was a social evil. State dinners at the Hayes White House became famous for guests pre-gaming before they arrived and immediately leaving afterward to go drink elsewhere. There were rumors that the White House staff snuck alcohol into fruit punch at one event, but Hayes never confirmed this. The ban lasted his entire term. The day Hayes left office, the incoming president, James Garfield, immediately brought alcohol back. But Garfield had his own peculiar talents. James Garfield could write in Greek with one hand and Latin with the other hand simultaneously, different languages, different scripts, at the same time. He would demonstrate this party trick for guests. Someone would give him two different prompts, one in Greek, one in Latin, and Garfield would write both answers at once, one hand writing each language. It's neurologically fascinating. Most people can't even rub their stomach and pat their head at the same time, and Garfield could write two dead languages simultaneously. He was deeply intelligent, taught classical languages before entering politics. The ambidextrous writing thing wasn't just a stunt. It was genuine skill from years of studying ancient texts. Garfield only served as president for 200 days before being assassinated, which is a tragedy. Imagine what else that brain could have done. But his successor had very different priorities, specifically regarding fashion. Chester A. Arthur owned 80 pairs of pants. 80. He was obsessive about clothing, changed outfits multiple times a day, had custom-tailored suits from New York. The man was a dedicated follower of fashion in a way that no president before or since has matched. Arthur would change clothes before dinner, change again if he went out for the evening, change again before bed. Witnesses reported he'd sometimes change outfits 3 or 4 times in a single day, just because. He had very specific ideas about what was appropriate for morning versus afternoon versus evening. When Arthur became president after Garfield's assassination, one of his first acts was to refuse to move into the White House until they completely redecorated. He thought the existing furniture was hideous. Arthur supervised the renovation personally, which delayed his moving in for weeks, but at least he brought style to the office. His successor, however, brought a very different kind of dedication. Grover Cleveland personally answered the White House telephone at night. This was the 1880s, and having a telephone in the White House was still relatively new technology. Most presidents ignored it or had staff handle it. Not Cleveland. He'd hear the phone ring late at night and would walk over and answer it himself. Just pick up and say hello. Confused citizens who had somehow gotten the White House number would suddenly find themselves talking directly to the President of the United States at 11 p.m. Cleveland found this amusing. He liked the directness of it. Sometimes people would call with actual policy questions, and Cleveland would discuss them right there on the phone in his nightshirt. His staff found this habit both charming and mildly alarming. What if a foreign adversary called? What if someone said something inflammatory? Cleveland didn't care. The phone was there. He answered it. It's perhaps the most accessible any president has ever been. But his successor had the opposite problem with new technology. Benjamin Harrison was terrified of electricity. The White House got electric lights installed during his term, 1891, but Harrison refused to touch the switches. He thought he'd be electrocuted. To be fair, electric lighting was very new and not entirely safe. There were legitimate concerns about fires and shocks, but Harrison took it to another level. He would leave lights on all night rather than risk touching the switch to turn them off. The White House staff had to turn the lights on and off for him. If Harrison was in a room and everyone else left, the lights stayed on until someone came back. His electricity bill must have been astronomical. His wife, Caroline, was equally nervous about the lights. They lived in a perpetually illuminated White House, just burning through electricity because nobody wanted to flip a switch. It's endearingly paranoid. But the next president had no such fears about modern technology. William McKinley kept a lucky red carnation pinned to his lapel. Every day. It was his signature look. He believed the flower brought him good luck, and honestly, for most of his life, it seemed to work. He had a successful political career, won the presidency, led the country through the Spanish-American War. Then, on September 6th, 1901, McKinley was at a public reception in Buffalo, New York. A little girl approached him and asked for his lucky carnation. McKinley, being kind, unpinned it and gave it to her. Hours later, a man named Leon Cholgos approached McKinley in the receiving line and shot him twice. McKinley died 8 days later. The timing is just cruel. The one day he gives away his lucky charm is the day he gets assassinated. It's probably coincidence, but it's the kind of coincidence that makes you believe in something larger and darker. But McKinley's successor was entirely fearless, almost recklessly so. Theodore Roosevelt's daughter, Alice, smoked cigarettes on the White House roof. She was 17, 18 years old, and absolutely uncontrollable. Teddy couldn't do anything with her. Alice would climb onto the roof, sit up there smoking, sometimes with friends, just hanging out above the formal rooms where her father conducted presidential business. Reporters loved her. She'd make outrageous statements to the press, carried a pet snake named Emily Spinach in her purse to parties, placed bets at horse races, jumped fully clothed into swimming pools at society events. Teddy famously said, "I can be president of the United States," or "I can control Alice. I cannot possibly do both." Alice lived to 96, spent her entire life doing exactly what she wanted, and never apologized for any of it. She's an icon. But while Teddy was struggling with his daughter, his successor was struggling with bathroom furniture. William Howard Taft got stuck in the White House bathtub. This actually happened. Taft weighed over 300 pounds, and the White House bathtub was not designed for a man of his size. One day, Taft got in, enjoyed his bath, then couldn't get out. He was wedged. They had to call for help. 6 men, according to accounts, had to pull him out of the tub. 6 grown men heaving on the President of the United States, extracting him from bathwater like a beached whale. Taft was reportedly mortified. Afterward, he had a custom bathtub installed, big enough for 4 normal-sized people. That tub stayed in the White House for years. Taft's bathtub incident is probably the most undignified presidential moment that didn't involve actual scandal. Just a man, too large for his tub, needing industrial-strength assistance. His successor had much smaller problems, but solved them in equally creative ways. Woodrow Wilson painted his golf balls black during World War I. This was 1917, and there was a push to conserve resources for the war effort. White paint, apparently. was needed for military purposes. Wilson loved golf, played constantly, but didn't want to seem wasteful during wartime. So he switched to black golf balls, just painted them black, went out and played with black golf balls on the White House lawn and at other courses. It's such a weird image. The President of the United States squinting at tiny black spheres in the grass, trying to lead the nation while also saving white paint for battleships or whatever they needed it for. Wilson was deeply committed to the war effort, even in small symbolic ways. The black golf balls were his personal contribution to conservation. It's silly and earnest at the same time, which somehow makes it more charming. But Wilson's commitment to propriety looks quaint compared to what the next president lost. Warren G. Harding lost the White House china in a poker game, the actual official White House china. Harding loved poker, played constantly, hosted games in the White House multiple times a week, which was technically illegal because Prohibition was in effect, and there was usually bootleg whiskey at these games. During one particular game, Harding bet a set of White House china. He lost. The china left the building. It belonged to the White House, to the American people, technically, and Harding gambled it away. His wife, Florence, was furious when she found out. She made him track down whoever won it and buy it back. Harding did, sheepishly, paying out of his own pocket. The china was returned. The whole incident was kept quiet at the time, but details leaked out later. It perfectly captures Harding's presidency, well-intentioned, friendly, and catastrophically poor judgment. But his successor was much more calculated, in strange ways. Calvin Coolidge had a peculiar sense of humor. He would ring the bell to summon White House servants, then hide. Just hide in his office or in a closet and watch through a crack as confused servants arrived, looked around for the president, found no one, and left bewildered. Then Coolidge would do it again 20 minutes later. Same servants, same confusion. He found this hilarious. Coolidge was famously quiet in public, barely spoke, but in private, he enjoyed these weird little pranks. The servants knew it was him, obviously, but what were they supposed to do? He was the president. You can't tell the president to stop ringing for you and then hiding. It's technically a hostile work environment, but in the gentlest way possible. Coolidge was also photographed wearing various costumes, including a full Native American headdress, for reasons nobody fully understands. The man contained multitudes, mostly silent multitudes, but the next president had secrets of a different kind. Herbert Hoover spoke Mandarin Chinese fluently, and he used it strategically. He and his wife, Lou, both learned Mandarin while living in China in their 20s. When Hoover became president, they realized they could speak Mandarin to each other in public and no one around them would understand. So they did. Constantly. In the White House, at state dinners, during official events. If they wanted to say something private, they'd just switch to Mandarin. It's a brilliant strategy, honestly. No need for coded language or private meetings. Just speak a language almost no one else in 1930s Washington knew. Reporters couldn't eavesdrop. Staff couldn't gossip. The Hoovers had total privacy in plain sight. There are transcripts of press conferences where you can see Hoover and Lou exchange quick Mandarin sentences before Hoover answers a question in English. It's subtle espionage in the most mundane setting. And speaking of unexpected talents, the next president brought Hollywood glamour to Washington. Franklin Delano Roosevelt had a favorite cocktail, and it was disgusting. The Bermuda rum swizzle with a raw egg. He'd make these himself, sometimes for guests, who would politely sip them while trying not to gag. The recipe involved dark rum, fruit juice, bitters, and a raw egg cracked right into the glass. FDR would shake it vigorously and serve it with complete confidence, as if this was perfectly normal. He learned the recipe during a visit to Bermuda years before his presidency and became devoted to it. The raw egg was supposed to add protein and texture, which it did, in the worst possible way. Guests at Hyde Park, his estate, learned to brace themselves if FDR offered to make drinks. Some historians suggest his inability to taste how terrible this cocktail was might be related to his smoking habit, which dulled his palate. Regardless, FDR served his egg rum concoction with presidential authority, but at least he wasn't making furniture from weapons of war. Harry Truman played poker on a table made from a Confederate cannon. Someone had taken an actual Civil War cannon, cut it, flattened it, and fashioned it into a poker table. Truman loved it. He hosted regular poker games in the White House, and this cannon table was his pride and joy. The symbolism is almost too perfect. The President of the United States, a man who'd served in World War I, gambling on the melted-down weapons of America's bloodiest conflict. Truman took his poker seriously. He played with cabinet members, journalists, friends. The games would go late into the night, cigars, smoking, drinks flowing, all on top of this repurposed instrument of death. Truman was a good player, reportedly. He understood odds and read people well, skills that probably served him in politics too. The table survived his presidency and ended up in a museum somewhere. But while Truman was strategic about poker, his successor was at war with much smaller adversaries. Dwight Eisenhower loved golf, had a putting green installed on the White House lawn, practiced constantly. And squirrels kept stealing his golf balls, just running off with them, burying them, treating them like oversized acorns. Eisenhower, the man who'd commanded D-Day, was being defeated by rodents. He complained to staff repeatedly, asked the groundskeepers to do something. Eventually, Eisenhower issued an actual order to have the squirrels trapped and relocated away from the White House grounds. They caught dozens of squirrels and moved them to Rock Creek Park. More squirrels arrived. It was an unwinnable war. Eisenhower spent 8 years battling squirrels for control of his putting green and never fully succeeded. There's something deeply humanizing about this. The Supreme Allied commander reduced to shouting at squirrels on his lawn. His successor had different physical challenges, though his were tragically more serious. John F. Kennedy wore a back brace constantly. He had chronic back problems from an old football injury and a PT boat accident during World War II. The brace was rigid, uncomfortable, but it let him stand upright and maintain the vigorous image he projected. On November 22, 1963, in Dallas, Kennedy was wearing that brace when the first bullet hit him in the upper back. The brace kept him upright, sitting straight. He didn't slump forward or fall to the side. And because he remained upright, he was a clear target for the second shot, the fatal one to his head. Without the brace, he might have collapsed after the first bullet, might have been below the line of fire. It's impossible to know for sure, but medical experts have suggested the brace may have cost him his life. A piece of medical equipment meant to help him, possibly holding him in place to die. His successor had his own peculiar approach to conducting business. Lyndon Johnson held meetings while sitting on the toilet, not occasionally, regularly. Johnson had no sense of personal boundaries. He'd be in the bathroom, door open, conducting presidential business while actively using the facilities. Staff members, senators, advisors would stand in the doorway or just inside, trying to maintain eye contact at appropriate levels, discussing Vietnam or civil rights legislation while Johnson sat there. He called this the Johnson treatment, though that phrase usually referred to his intimidation tactics. This was part of it, though, making people so uncomfortable they'd agree to anything just to leave. Johnson was 6'4", loud, and completely shameless. Using the bathroom during meetings was a power move, a way of establishing dominance. It worked, mostly because everyone was too horrified to push back, but at least Johnson's bathroom habits weren't recorded for posterity, unlike the next president's everything. Richard Nixon taped everything, every conversation in the Oval Office, the cabinet room, his executive office building hideaway, his phones, everything. Over 3,700 hours of tape. Nixon installed the system himself, or rather ordered it installed, in 1971. He wanted a record of his presidency for historical purposes. Instead, those tapes destroyed him. The Watergate scandal broke. Investigators demanded the tapes. Nixon refused. The Supreme Court ordered him to hand them over, and there it was. All his paranoia, his anger, his plotting, preserved on magnetic tape. 18 and a half minutes famously erased, probably by his secretary, but enough remained to end his presidency. Nixon resigned rather than face certain impeachment, all because he recorded himself committing crimes. If he'd never installed the taping system, he might have survived Watergate. The irony is so thick it's almost suffocating. But his successor had a surprisingly glamorous past. Gerald Ford was a male model. Before politics, before law school, Ford appeared on the cover of Cosmopolitan magazine in 1942. He modeled for Look magazine too. Ford was athletic, played football at the University of Michigan, and someone suggested modeling. He needed money for law school, so Ford put on nice clothes and posed for fashion photographers. The photos still exist. There's Gerald Ford, future president of the United States, looking handsome in a suit on a magazine cover. It's jarring if you only know him as the guy who pardoned Nixon and fell down airplane stairs. But in his 20s, Ford was genuinely good-looking and athletic. He even got offers to play professional football, but turned them down for law school. Smart choice, probably. The modeling work paid for his education, and decades later, it gave everyone a bizarre fun fact. But Ford's predecessor had witnessed something even stranger. Jimmy Carter reported a UFO sighting, October 1969, years before he became president. Carter was in Leary, Georgia, about to give a speech to a Lions Club. He and about 10 other people saw something in the sky. A bright light, changing colors, moving in ways that didn't match any aircraft they recognized. Carter watched it for 10 to 15 minutes. He was convinced enough that he filed an official report with the International UFO Bureau in 1973. Carter was a naval officer trained in engineering and nuclear physics, not someone prone to hysteria. He later said he didn't think it was aliens, necessarily, just something he couldn't explain. During his presidential campaign, he promised to release all government UFO files if elected. He didn't, claiming national security concerns after he was briefed, which either means there's nothing there, or there's something there and it's classified. Either way, Carter saw something weird. But his successor had a much simpler addiction. Ronald Reagan kept a jar of jelly beans on his desk at all times. Started eating them in 1966 when he quit smoking. Reagan was a heavy pipe smoker, decided to stop, needed something to do with his mouth. Someone suggested jelly beans. Reagan became obsessed, had them everywhere. The Oval Office had a jar on the desk, a jar on the side table, a jar in the desk drawer. The cabinet room had jelly beans. Air Force One had jelly beans. Reagan went through about 300,000 jelly beans during his 8 years in office. The Jelly Belly Company created a new flavor, blueberry, specifically so Reagan could have red, white, and blue jelly beans at his inauguration. He offered them to visiting dignitaries, to staff, to reporters. The man was a jelly bean evangelist. His favorite flavor was licorice, which is objectively the worst flavor, but he was president, so nobody argued. His successor had equally strong opinions about vegetables. George H.W. Bush banned broccoli from Air Force One. Just straight up banned it. March 1990. Bush held a press conference and announced he was the President of the United States, and he didn't have to eat broccoli anymore. His mother had made him eat it as a child. He'd hated it for decades. Now he had the power to ban it, so he did. No broccoli on Air Force One, no broccoli at the White House, no broccoli anywhere near him. Barbara Bush, his wife, reportedly agreed with this policy. Broccoli farmers were furious. They sent truckloads of broccoli to the White House in protest. Bush refused to back down. The broccoli stayed banned. It's such a petty use of presidential power, and also completely understandable. We all have foods we hate. Bush just had the authority to make his hatred official policy. but at least he engaged with basic technology, unlike his relationship with supermarket scanners. Bill Clinton sent 2 emails during his entire presidency. 2. The first one was on March 2, 1993, making it the first presidential email in history. He sent it to test the system, basically just confirming that email worked in the White House. The second email was to John Glenn when Glenn returned to space in 1998 at age 77. That was it. 2 emails in 8 years. To be fair, email was still relatively new technology in the early 90s, and presidents don't usually type their own correspondence. But still, 2 emails. Clinton was aware of the internet, talked about the information superhighway, but personally, he just didn't email. Too busy with other things, probably. His staff handled digital communication. Clinton preferred phone calls and face-to-face meetings anyway, but his successor had a much more active college career worth noting. George W. Bush was a cheerleader at Yale, not as a joke, officially. Bush was the head cheerleader his senior year, 1968. There are photos. Bush in a sweater with a megaphone, jumping around, leading cheers at football games. He took it seriously, apparently. Was good at it. Cheerleading at Yale in the 60s was a male-dominated activity, considered a position of school spirit leadership rather than the athletic performance it is now. Bush was outgoing, loud, energetic. Made sense for him. The photos resurfaced during his presidential campaigns, and people didn't quite know what to make of them. Here was the Republican candidate for president, former fighter pilot, Texas oil man, holding pom-poms and grinning at a football game. It humanized him for some people, seemed trivial to others. But Bush never apologized for it. Seemed genuinely proud of his cheerleading days. And speaking of unexpected hobbies, the next president had a fascinating collection. Barack Obama collected comic books as a kid, specifically Spider-Man and Conan the Barbarian. He's talked about this in interviews, how he loved the escapism, the storytelling, the artwork. Obama grew up moving around a lot, and comic books were a constant, something he could take with him. He loved Spider-Man because Peter Parker was a nerdy kid who got powers and had to figure out how to use them responsibly. Very on brand for Obama, honestly. The with great power comes great responsibility thing. Obama probably still has some of those comics somewhere. During his presidency, he appeared as a character in an actual Spider-Man comic, which must have been surreal for him. Meeting your childhood hero by becoming a character in their universe. It's a small detail, but it makes him more real. Everyone has their childhood obsessions. Obama's just happened to involve web slinging, but his successor had very different reasons for avoiding certain substances. Donald Trump doesn't drink alcohol. Never has. His older brother, Fred Trump Jr., died of alcoholism in 1981 at age 43. Trump was close with his brother, watched him struggle with addiction, watched it destroy his life. Trump decided then he would never drink. Not wine, not beer, nothing. He's kept that promise for over 40 years. It's one of the few things about Trump that's consistent and disciplined. He doesn't smoke either, for similar reasons. At state dinners, while everyone else drank champagne, Trump had Diet Coke. He served fast food to visiting sports teams at the White House and thought it was fine because he genuinely likes fast food. But alcohol? Never touched it. The loss of his brother affected him deeply, more than he usually lets on. It's a rare moment of Trump being genuinely cautious about something, but restraint is relative, and the next president had his own peculiar form of commitment. Joe Biden commuted to Washington, D.C. on Amtrak every single day for 36 years while he was a senator. Every day. Round trip from Wilmington, Delaware to D.C. and back. Biden's first wife and daughter died in a car accident in 1972, shortly after he was elected to the Senate. His 2 sons survived, but were injured. Biden seriously considered not taking the Senate seat, But he was sworn in at the hospital where his sons were recovering, and he made a decision. He'd commute daily so he could be home with his sons every night. So he took the train. Every morning, every evening, for 36 years, over 8,000 round trips, Biden became famous on Amtrak. Conductors knew him, other passengers knew him. They called him Amtrak Joe. He continued even when he became vice president for a while. It's perhaps the most humanizing thing about Biden's career. Just a dad taking the train home to his kids. But speaking of humanizing details, let's circle back to some earlier presidents. George Washington's false teeth clicked when he spoke. They weren't wooden. That's a myth. They were made from human teeth, animal teeth, and ivory, held together with metal springs. The springs made noise. In quiet rooms, you could hear clicking and creaking when Washington talked. People pretended not to notice, obviously. You don't tell the president his teeth are clicking. But it's in diaries and letters from people who met him. The teeth were uncomfortable, too. Washington's jaw structure changed as he aged and lost his natural teeth, so the dentures never fit quite right. They pushed his lips out, changed the shape of his face. Portrait painters had to work around this. In early portraits, Washington looks normal. In later ones, his mouth looks strange, almost puffy. That's the dentures. The man spent his final years in chronic dental pain with clicking teeth, which explains why he looks so serious in paintings. But at least Washington's pets were conventional, unlike some of his successors. John Quincy Adams kept an alligator in the White House East Room. The Marquis de Lafayette gave it to him as a gift, because apparently that's what you gave presidents in the 1820s. Just live alligators. Adams kept the thing in a bathtub in the East Room for several months. It became a conversation piece. Visitors would tour the White House, and there'd be this alligator, just sitting in a tub, occasionally hissing at people. Adams found it amusing. His wife, Louisa, less so. She allegedly refused to go into the East Room while the alligator was there. Eventually, Adams gave the alligator to someone else, possibly a zoo or a collector. It left the White House alive, which is more than can be said for some presidential pets. The whole incident raises questions about White House security and common sense, but different times, different standards. At least Adams' pet stayed contained, which brings us to Jefferson's disaster. Thomas Jefferson kept bear cubs as pets, 2 of them. Someone gave them to him, and Jefferson thought it would be interesting to raise bears at the White House. It was not interesting. It was chaos. The bears were technically in cages, but they escaped. Multiple times. Bear cubs are strong and surprisingly clever. They'd get out and wander through the White House, terrifying staff, knocking things over, being generally destructive. One bear apparently made it into the kitchen once and destroyed several days' worth of food supplies. Another time, both bears got out simultaneously, and the staff had to chase them through the grounds with nets. Jefferson eventually gave up and sent the bears away. He later wrote that keeping wild animals in captivity was perhaps not advisable in a residence of government, which is Jefferson speak for a terrible idea, never again. But at least the bears didn't attend any parties, unlike what happened at Jackson's inauguration. Andrew Jackson's inauguration party in 1829 was absolute chaos. Jackson invited the public to a White House reception after the ceremony. 20,000 people showed up. 20,000. They mobbed the White House, tracking mud everywhere, standing on furniture in their boots to see the president, breaking glasses, spilling food. The crowd was so dense that Jackson was nearly crushed against a wall. His friends had to form a human barrier to protect him. Servants brought tubs of orange punch out onto the lawn just to lure people outside. It worked, sort of. The party caused thousands of dollars in damage. Furniture destroyed. China broken, curtains ripped. Jackson thought it was wonderful. The People's House, he called it. A celebration of democracy. The White House staff spent weeks cleaning up. But at least Jackson gave America one lasting gift. a two-letter word we still use daily. Martin Van Buren coined the term okay. Maybe. The etymology is disputed, but one popular theory traces it to Van Buren's nickname, Old Kinderhook, named after his hometown in New York. His supporters formed the OK Club during the 1840 election. They'd use OK as a shorthand for all right or approved, as in Old Kinderhook approves. The term caught on. Other theories exist. It might come from all correct, a humorous misspelling of all correct that was popular in the 1830s, or from West African languages, or from Scottish, or from a dozen other sources. Linguists argue about this constantly, but the Old Kinderhook theory is compelling because the timing matches the term's explosive popularity. Regardless of its true origin, OK is now the most recognized word on Earth. If Van Buren did coin it, that's his greatest legacy, which says something about his presidency. Speaking of legacy problems, the next president had a very empty administration. John Tyler had no vice president for his entire term. He was vice president under William Henry Harrison. Harrison died 31 days into office. Tyler became president, and that was it. No replacement VP. The Constitution didn't provide for filling a vacant vice presidency until the 25th Amendment in 1967. So Tyler served from April 1841 to March 1845 with no backup. Nobody second in line. If Tyler had died, there would have been a constitutional crisis. Who becomes president? The Speaker of the House? The Senate President pro tempore? Nobody was quite sure. Tyler was also the first vice president to assume the presidency due to death. Some people argued he should just be acting president, not the actual president. Tyler insisted he was the real president, took the oath of office, moved into the White House, and that set the precedent for all future successions. But Tyler was healthy, served his term, and we avoided crisis. His successor was much less lucky with timing. James K. Polk worked himself to death. Not metaphorically, literally. Polk worked 18-hour days, every day, for his entire presidency. He had a list of goals: reduce tariffs, establish an independent treasury, settle the Oregon boundary, and acquire California. He accomplished all four. But it destroyed his health. Polk was 53 when he left office in March 1849. He looked 70, exhausted, frail, gray. He died 3 months later on June 15, 1849, probably from cholera, but his body was so weakened from stress that any illness would have killed him. Polk served one term by choice, said from the beginning he wouldn't run for re-election, intended to accomplish his goals and retire. He did, but he didn't get to enjoy retirement. Just died. The man squeezed every possible achievement into 4 years and paid with his life. His successor had a much shorter presidency, for different reasons. Zachary Taylor died from eating cherries and drinking cold milk. On July 4th, 1850, Taylor attended a fundraising event for the Washington Monument. It was brutally hot. Taylor ate a bowl of cherries and drank iced milk. He felt sick almost immediately. 5 days later, he was dead. The official cause was likely cholera morbus or acute gastroenteritis. The cherries and milk didn't directly kill him, but they probably were contaminated with bacteria. 1850 Washington, D.C. had terrible sanitation. Food safety didn't exist. Taylor's doctor treated him with calomel, a mercury compound that definitely made things worse. Modern analysis suggests Taylor died from cholera, possibly typhoid, definitely not helped by mercury poisoning from his medication. But the story persists. The president ate cherries and milk at a July 4th picnic and died. It's weirdly mundane. No assassination, no dramatic illness, just bad produce and worse medicine. His successor had better luck, at least regarding health. Millard Fillmore's wife, Abigail, was his teacher. Fillmore grew up poor in upstate New York, had minimal formal education. Abigail Powers was his schoolteacher when they met. She was better educated than he was. When they married, Abigail continued helping Fillmore with his education. She taught him literature, history, helped him study law. By the time Fillmore became president, Abigail was arguably the most educated First Lady to date. She established the first permanent White House library, filling it with books she chose herself. Abigail believed the White House should be a center of learning. She attended congressional debates, which was unusual for women at the time. When she died in 1853, shortly after leaving the White House, Fillmore was devastated. He later said Abigail was the smartest person he ever knew, and he was probably right. She'd literally educated him. But intelligence didn't always spare you from tragedy, as the next president learned. Franklin Pierce memorized his entire inaugural address, 3,000 words, delivered it on March 4th, 1853, in a snowstorm, without notes. Pierce was 48, the youngest president elected at that point. He wanted to prove his capability, so he memorized the speech. All of it. Stood there in the snow for half an hour, reciting from memory, never faltering. It was impressive, technically, even if the content was forgettable. Pierce's speech talked about national unity and avoiding sectional conflict over slavery. He failed at both. His presidency is considered one of the worst in history. But that speech? Flawlessly delivered. Pierce had a sharp memory, which later became a curse. He remembered every mistake, every failure, every moment he could have acted differently. Spent his post-presidency drinking heavily, haunted by his time in office. But at least Pierce tried to do something meaningful, unlike some of his predecessors. James Buchanan bought slaves in Washington, D.C. so he could immediately free them. This was before the Civil War, when slavery was still legal in D.C. Buchanan was from Pennsylvania, personally opposed to slavery, but politically tried to appease the South. His solution to this moral dilemma was strange. He'd purchase enslaved people at market price, then immediately sign their emancipation papers. It was legal. He paid the previous owner, the enslaved person gained freedom. Buchanan's conscience was theoretically clear. He did this several times during his career. It's a weird middle ground. Not abolitionist activism, not slave owner behavior, just transactional morality. Buchanan thought he was being practical. History judges him as ineffectual. He watched the country slide towards civil war and did essentially nothing to stop it. His presidency ended in March 1861. The war started a month later. But at least Buchanan didn't witness as much tragedy as the next president's son. Robert Todd Lincoln was present at 3 presidential assassinations, not as the assassin, obviously, as an incredibly unlucky bystander. April 1865. Robert was at the White House when they brought his father, Abraham Lincoln, dying from Booth's bullet to a house across from Ford's Theater. July 1881. Robert, now Secretary of War, was at the train station when Charles Guiteau shot President Garfield. September 1901. Robert attended the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo and was nearby when Leon Czolgosz shot President McKinley. 3 assassinations, 3 presidents, 1 extremely cursed man. After McKinley, Robert Lincoln refused to attend any more presidential events. He told people he was a jinx. He wasn't invited to many presidential functions after that anyway. People were superstitious. Robert lived until 1926, outliving everyone from his father's era, probably wondering what he'd done to deserve such terrible luck. But at least Robert had a comfortable life, unlike his father's successor who knew manual labor well. Andrew Johnson was a tailor before he entered politics, not like he owned a tailor shop. He was the tailor. He sewed clothes with his own hands. Johnson never forgot this skill. Even as president, he made his own suits sometimes. There are accounts of Johnson in the White House, sitting with needle and thread, adjusting his own clothes because he didn't trust anyone else to do it right. He'd learned tailoring as an apprentice when he was young and poor in North Carolina. The skill gave him a living, a sense of pride, and a chip on his shoulder about wealthy politicians who'd never worked with their hands. Johnson's tailor background informed his politics. He saw himself as a champion of working people, though his racism and opposition to Reconstruction complicated that significantly. But the sewing thing? Verifiable. The man was president and still mended his own pants. His successor, unfortunately, had a habit that caught up with him. Ulysses S. Grant smoked 20 cigars a day. Minimum. Sometimes more. After the Battle of Fort Donelson during the Civil War, Grant's picture appeared in newspapers with a cigar in his mouth. Admirers sent him boxes of cigars as gifts. Thousands of cigars. Grant figured if people were sending them, he might as well smoke them. He smoked constantly for the rest of his life. During his presidency, through his retirement, always with a cigar. The habit caught up with him. Grant developed throat cancer in 1884. He knew it was from the cigars. By then it was too late. Grant spent his final year racing to finish his memoirs before the cancer killed him. He finished the manuscript days before he died in July 1885. The memoirs were published, became a bestseller, paid off his debts, provided for his wife. But Grant died in pain, unable to talk, barely able to swallow, destroyed by tobacco. His successor's wife, at least, brought more positive change. Lucy Hayes was the First Lady with a college degree. She graduated from Wesleyan Female College in Cincinnati in 1850. This was rare. Very few women attended college in the mid-1800s. Even fewer graduated. Lucy was intelligent, well-read, and politically engaged. She attended congressional debates with her husband, Rutherford, when he was a congressman. She had opinions on policy. Some people called her Lemonade Lucy because of the White House alcohol ban, but that nickname was partly created by people who resented a first lady having influence. Lucy didn't care. She supported temperance, women's education, and prison reform. She spoke publicly about these issues, which was unusual for the time. Lucy was the first lady to be called First Lady in print, according to some sources. After leaving the White House, she continued advocating for women's rights and education until her death in 1889. A college degree in 1850 was revolutionary. Lucy earned hers and used it. And speaking of revolutions, the next era brings us into the 20th century. James Garfield's assassin, Charles Guiteau, bought his gun specifically because it had ivory grips. He thought it would look better in a museum. Guiteau planned the assassination for weeks in 1881. He went to a gun shop and chose a British Bulldog revolver with fancy ivory handles instead of a cheaper model with wooden grips. His reasoning, written in his diary, was that the gun would be displayed in a museum after he became famous for killing the president. He wanted it to look impressive. Guiteau shot Garfield at a train station on July 2nd, 1881. Garfield died 11 weeks later from infections related to the wound, made worse by doctors probing with unsterilized hands. Guiteau was hanged in June 1882. The gun did end up in a museum eventually. Guiteau was right about that part, at least. His vanity was so extreme he planned his fame down to which gun would photograph better. But Garfield's successor had aesthetic concerns of a different kind. Chester Arthur redecorated the entire White House when he became president, but first he emptied it. Arthur thought the existing furniture was hideous, outdated, and beneath presidential dignity, so in 1881, he had everything removed. Everything. They held a public auction and sold 24 wagons full of White House furniture. 24 wagons, sofas, chairs, desks, tables, paintings, lamps. Some of it dated back to John Adams. Historical pieces just sold off. Arthur didn't care. He wanted the White House to reflect modern 1880s style. He hired Louis Comfort Tiffany to redesign the interior. Tiffany installed stained glass screens, elaborate wallpaper, and completely new furniture. The results were stunning by 1880s standards, though most of it was removed by later presidents who found it too ornate. Arthur's redecoration delayed his moving into the White House for weeks. He refused to live there until it met his standards, but at least Arthur's health issues were public, unlike what comes next. Grover Cleveland had secret cancer surgery on a yacht. Summer of 1893. Cleveland discovered a rough patch in his mouth. Doctors diagnosed it as cancer, but the country was in an economic panic. Cleveland worried that news of presidential cancer would worsen the crisis, so they arranged secret surgery. On July 1st, 1893, Cleveland boarded a friend's yacht, the Oneida, supposedly for a vacation. A surgical team was waiting. They performed the operation while the yacht sailed around Long Island Sound. Removed a tumor and part of Cleveland's upper jaw. The surgery took 90 minutes. They fitted Cleveland with a rubber prosthesis to fill the gap so his face looked normal. Cleveland recovered on the yacht. Returned to Washington. Nobody knew. One reporter wrote about it but was dismissed as a liar. The truth didn't come out until 1917, 9 years after Cleveland died. The man had major cancer surgery on a boat to avoid market panic, but his successor brought more wholesome changes to the White House. Benjamin Harrison's wife, Caroline, installed the first White House Christmas tree. December 1889. Christmas trees were becoming popular in America, but no president had put one in the White House before. Caroline Harrison thought the White House should embrace the tradition. She had a tree brought in, decorated it with candles, toys, and ornaments, and placed it in the upstairs Oval Room. Her grandchildren, who lived in the White House, were delighted. Caroline made it a family affair. The tree became a White House tradition, though not every president continued it. Theodore Roosevelt oddly banned Christmas trees from the White House for conservation reasons until his children snuck one into a closet. But Caroline started it. She was also the first lady to use electricity in the White House, though she was terrified of it. Caroline died of tuberculosis in 1892 while Harrison was still president. The next president's encounter with modern technology was under much worse circumstances. William McKinley was the first president to ride in a car. Unfortunately, it was an electric ambulance after he'd been shot. September 6, 1901, in Buffalo. McKinley was shot by Leon Czolgosz at the Pan American Exposition. They rushed him to the exposition's emergency hospital in an electric-powered ambulance, one of the new modern vehicles being showcased at the fair. McKinley was conscious during the ride, reportedly impressed by how smooth it was compared to horse-drawn carriages. The ambulance was faster, too, technology advancing even as the president lay dying. McKinley survived the initial surgery but developed gangrene. Died 8 days later. The ambulance ride was his only experience with automotive technology. He never rode in a car under normal circumstances, never enjoyed the innovation, just got rushed to a hospital in one. It's grimly fitting for a president whose time bridged 2 centuries. His successor, however, embraced modern violence much more enthusiastically. Theodore Roosevelt boxed in the White House, had a ring set up, sparred with military aides, cabinet members, anyone willing. Roosevelt loved boxing, thought it built character. He was 40-something years old, president of the United States, getting punched in the face for fun. In 1904, during one of these matches, a young military aide threw a hard left hook, caught Roosevelt directly in the eye, detached his retina. Roosevelt didn't tell anyone, kept boxing for a while. His vision in that eye gradually faded. By 1908, Roosevelt was blind in his left eye. Completely, permanently. He never publicly admitted it, didn't want to seem weak. Roosevelt switched to judo instead, which he considered safer. He became so proficient he earned a brown belt. The man lost an eye and just pivoted to a different combat sport. No complaints, no regrets. But while Roosevelt was brawling, his successor was keeping livestock on the White House lawn. William Howard Taft was the last president to keep a cow on the White House lawn. Her name was Pauline Wayne. Pauline was a Holstein, provided fresh milk for the Taft family. This was 1909 to 1913. Keeping a cow at the White House wasn't that unusual historically. Several presidents did it. Fresh milk, no refrigeration issues. But Taft was the last. After him, the White House got milk delivered like normal people. Pauline lived in a small barn on the grounds. White House staff milked her daily. She was apparently a calm, friendly cow. Good temperament. Pauline became mildly famous. Newspapers wrote about her. Children sent her fan mail. When Taft left office in 1913, Pauline was sent to a farm in Wisconsin where she lived out her days. The Secret Service was probably relieved. Protecting the president is hard enough without also protecting his dairy cow. But the next president's health crisis made protection even more complicated. Woodrow Wilson suffered a massive stroke in October 1919. It left him partially paralyzed, barely functional. And his wife, Edith, basically ran the country for the next 17 months. Wilson was in his second term. The stroke happened at a crucial time, right after he'd been campaigning for the League of Nations. Edith decided to hide the severity of his condition. She controlled all access to the president, decided which matters he saw, which he didn't, made decisions herself and claimed they were Wilson's. Cabinet members were suspicious but couldn't get around her. Some historians call it the first female presidency, though Edith never claimed that title. She said she was just stewarding her husband's decisions. Maybe. Or maybe she was making them herself. We'll never fully know. Wilson served out his term, left office in March 1921, still partially paralyzed. Died in 1924. Edith lived until 1961, never fully explaining what happened. But at least Wilson's secret stayed hidden during his lifetime, unlike the next presidents. Warren G. Harding had a secret love child. For decades, this was rumor and speculation. Harding had an affair with Nan Britton, a woman 30 years younger than him. Britton claimed Harding fathered her daughter, Elizabeth, born in 1919. Harding died in 1923. Never acknowledged the child. Britton wrote a book about the affair in 1927. Harding's family denied everything, called her a liar. For 88 years, it remained unproven. Then in 2015, DNA testing confirmed it. Elizabeth's descendants agreed to genetic testing. Results showed 99% certainty that Harding was Elizabeth's father. The affair was real. The child was real. Harding had lied to everyone, or at least never told the truth. Britton had been telling the truth all along. The affair allegedly included encounters in a White House coat closet, which is both tawdry and impressive from a logistics standpoint. But Harding wasn't the only president with unusual White House equipment. Calvin Coolidge kept a mechanical horse in the White House, an exercise horse, rode it in his pajamas. This was the 1920s, and mechanical horses were the cutting-edge fitness technology, essentially a saddle on a spring-loaded frame that bounced and tilted to simulate riding. Coolidge had one installed in his bedroom. He'd ride it for exercise, sometimes in the morning before getting dressed. Staff would occasionally walk past and see the President of the United States bouncing on a fake horse in his nightclothes. Coolidge reportedly found it relaxing. Good for his digestion, he claimed. The mechanical horse stayed in the White House throughout his presidency. When Coolidge left office in 1929, the horse stayed behind for the next president. Whether Hoover used it is unclear, but Coolidge loved that thing. Rode it regularly, pajamas and all, because why not? Though if you think that's strange, the next president's sons had even more exotic pets. Herbert Hoover's son had pet alligators that roamed the White House grounds. Alan Hoover brought them back from somewhere, because apparently every generation of Americans thinks alligators make good pets. These weren't tiny baby alligators. They were decent-sized, big enough to be concerning. Alan kept them outside, theoretically in enclosures, but they got loose, multiple times. There are accounts of White House staff encountering alligators on the lawn, just casually finding a reptile near the Rose Garden. The Secret Service was not thrilled. Visitors were nervous, but Alan Hoover loved those alligators. Eventually, the alligators were sent to a zoo, probably after someone important nearly got bitten. Hoover's presidency coincided with the Great Depression, so the alligator situation was likely the least of his concerns. But the image persists: alligators wandering White House grounds during America's worst economic crisis. At least the next president's pet had proper public relations support. Franklin D. Roosevelt's dog, Fala, had his own press secretary. Not officially, but effectively. Fala was a Scottish Terrier, FDR's constant companion. The dog appeared in photographs, sat in on meetings, traveled with Roosevelt everywhere. The public loved Fala. Mail poured in addressed to the dog. Reporters asked about him, so the White House assigned someone to handle Fala-related press inquiries, respond to his mail, coordinate photo opportunities. Fala became the most famous presidential pet in American history at that point. When Republicans accused Roosevelt of wasting taxpayer money by sending a destroyer to retrieve Fala from Alaska, Roosevelt defended his dog in a speech. The Fala speech became famous. Roosevelt's deadpan defense of his dog was brilliant political theater. Fala outlived Roosevelt, stayed with Eleanor until the dog died in 1952. But while Fala had name recognition, the next president had name confusion. Harry Truman's middle name is just S, not an initial standing for a full name, just the letter S. His parents couldn't decide whether to name him after his grandfather Solomon Young or his grandfather Anderson Ship Truman, so they compromised with S, honoring both and neither. Truman's full legal name was Harry S. Truman. Grammarians argue whether the S should have a period after it. The Library of Congress says no period, since it's not an abbreviation. But Truman himself used both S and S inconsistently throughout his life. Legal documents from his presidency show both versions. It drove editors and historians crazy. What do you do with a middle name that's just a letter? Truman didn't care. He signed his name however felt right that day. The ambiguity was very on brand for a man known for plain speaking and making tough decisions. Sometimes things just are what they are. No explanation needed. But while Truman's name was simple, his successor had more artistic pursuits. Dwight Eisenhower painted over 200 oil paintings while president. This wasn't a publicity stunt. Eisenhower genuinely loved painting, took it up seriously after World War II as a way to relax. He painted landscapes, portraits, still lifes, worked on them in his private time, between meetings, late at night, had an easel set up in the White House. Eisenhower gave many paintings away as gifts to friends and visiting dignitaries. Some were quite good. Others were charitably enthusiastic. He took lessons, studied technique, genuinely tried to improve. Painting was his escape from nuclear brinkmanship and Cold War tension. Winston Churchill also painted, and the two men bonded over it. They discussed brush techniques and color theory between discussions of NATO strategy. Eisenhower painted until his death in 1969. Many of his paintings are in museums now, not because they're masterpieces, but because they're fascinating artifacts of a president trying to find peace through art. His successor, meanwhile, found peace through furniture. John F. Kennedy's rocking chair was custom made for his bad back. Kennedy had chronic back pain, and his doctors recommended a rocking chair to help. So Kennedy had one specially built. The The chair was in the Oval Office, in the residence, taken with him when he traveled. Kennedy rocked in it during meetings. It became his signature. After his assassination in 1963, that rocking chair became a powerful symbol. Jackie Kennedy kept it. Years later, it was sold at auction. In 2013, the chair sold for $574,000. Over $500,000 for a chair. But it wasn't just furniture, it was where Kennedy sat during the Cuban Missile Crisis, where he made decisions that shaped history. The chair represented both his physical pain and his leadership under pressure. Every rock was a moment of thought, of planning, of trying to save the world while managing chronic agony. The next president had different ways of handling pressure, and his staff probably wished he'd used a rocking chair. Lyndon Johnson picked up his beagles by the ears on live television. April 1964. Johnson was on the White House lawn with his two beagles, him and her. Yes, those were their names. A photographer was there. Johnson wanted to demonstrate the dog's good behavior, or something, so he grabbed one beagle by the ears and lifted it up. The dog yelped. Cameras captured everything. Dog lovers across America were furious. Letters poured into the White House. How dare the president hurt his dogs? The American Kennel Club released a statement saying you should never lift a dog by its ears. Johnson was baffled by the response. He thought he was being playful. Clearly, he was wrong. Johnson issued an apology, sort of. Said the dog was fine, which it was. But his public image took a hit. Funny how a man could escalate the Vietnam War with less immediate backlash than picking up his dog wrong. But at least Johnson faced his problems head-on, unlike his successor's approach to mice. Richard Nixon once called the Secret Service to remove a mouse from his bedroom. Middle of the night, 1970-something. Nixon saw a mouse in his room. Could have ignored it, could have tried to catch it himself. Instead, he called the Secret Service. The agents whose job was to take a bullet for the president had to come catch a mouse. They did. Professionally. Without complaint, presumably. The mouse was removed. Nixon went back to sleep. This story leaked years later from former Secret Service agents. It's both humanizing and absurd. Here's the president, paranoid about leaks and enemies, but terrified of a tiny mouse. Nixon was apparently scared of mice his entire life. His childhood fear never went away. So, even as president, with the nuclear codes and the weight of the world, he couldn't handle a rodent. The Secret Service has seen everything. Presidents in crises, presidents in danger, and apparently presidents scared of mice. But while Nixon's fears were small, his successor's first act as president was monumental in its simplicity. Gerald Ford pardoned Richard Nixon with a handwritten note. September 8, 1974. Ford had been president for exactly 1 month. Nixon had resigned in disgrace, facing certain impeachment. Ford decided a full pardon was necessary to help the country move on. He handwrote a note explaining his reasoning, then gave a televised address. The decision destroyed Ford's presidency. His approval ratings plummeted. Many believed Ford and Nixon had made a corrupt deal. Ford insisted he hadn't, said it was the right thing to do for national healing. Historians still debate whether he was right. The handwritten note is in the National Archives now. You can read Ford's reasoning in his own script. Simple, direct, explaining why he was pardoning a man who'd broken the law and betrayed public trust. Ford lost the 1976 election partly because of that pardon. He never regretted it. Said it was worth losing the presidency to help the country heal. The next president brought very different priorities to the White House, including environmental ones. Jimmy Carter installed solar panels on the White House roof. 1979. 32 solar thermal panels to heat water. Carter was deeply committed to energy independence and renewable energy. He gave a speech about it, saying the panels symbolized America's commitment to a clean energy future. The panels worked fine. Heated water, saved energy, did exactly what they were supposed to do. Then Ronald Reagan became president in 1981. Reagan had the solar panels removed in 1986 during roof repairs, never put them back up. The panels sat in a government warehouse for years. One set eventually ended up at a college in Maine. Another set went to China. The decision to remove them was symbolic. Reagan didn't believe in Carter's energy policies, didn't want the reminder on the White House roof. It took until 2002 for solar panels to return to the White House. Carter's panels would have lasted longer if they'd been allowed to stay. But speaking of Reagan, his background was surprisingly heroic. Ronald Reagan was a lifeguard as a teenager. Saved 77 lives. Summer jobs from 1926 to 1932 at Rock River in Dixon, Illinois. Reagan worked 7 summers, 12-hour shifts, scanning the water constantly. Every time he pulled someone out, he'd carve a notch in a log near his station. 77 notches. 77 people who would have drowned if Reagan hadn't been there. Some were children, some were adults, some were strong swimmers who'd gotten in trouble. Reagan was a powerful swimmer, confident in the water. Years later, during his presidency, someone asked if he'd really saved 77 people. Reagan showed them photos of the log with the notches. He'd kept records. It wasn't an exaggeration. The man saved 77 actual human lives before he was 21 years old. That's more direct, tangible good than most people do in a lifetime. Everything else Reagan did, for better or worse, came after that. But while Reagan saved lives in the water, his successor kept risking his own in the air. George H.W. Bush jumped out of planes at age 80, and again at 85. Bush had been a naval aviator in World War II, shot down over the Pacific in 1944, rescued by a submarine, developed a lifelong fear of having bailed out too early, of not doing everything he could for his crew. So, on his 75th birthday in 1999, Bush went skydiving. Just decided to do it. Strapped himself to an instructor and jumped from a plane. He loved it. Did it again at 80, and again at 85 in 2009, and again at 90 in 2014. Bush kept skydiving into his 90s, facing his old fear repeatedly, proving to himself he could. His final jump was celebrated worldwide. The man was a former president, a World War II veteran with a long life behind him, and he was still jumping out of planes. Meanwhile, his successor was making musical appearances that were slightly less death-defying. Bill Clinton played saxophone on the Arsenio Hall show during the 1992 presidential campaign, wearing sunglasses. It was June. Clinton walked on stage, grabbed his sax, and played Heartbreak Hotel. This had never happened before. Presidential candidates didn't go on late-night shows, didn't play instruments, didn't wear sunglasses and try to look cool. Clinton did. He was 45, running against George H.W. Bush, and decided appearing on Arsenio Hall would reach younger voters. It worked. The appearance made Clinton seem relatable, human, fun. Not just another boring politician. The saxophone became part of his brand. Clinton had played sax since high school, considered pursuing music professionally before choosing politics. The Arsenio Hall appearance was genuine, not a stunt. Clinton could actually play. The performance helped him win the election. Political consultants still study that appearance as a masterclass in campaign strategy. Sometimes being yourself is the smartest political move. His successor, however, had very different ideas about campaign food. George W. Bush banned cheeseburgers from the press plane. Campaign Trail 2000. The press corps traveling with Bush's campaign had been eating cheeseburgers constantly. Someone got sick. Multiple people got sick. Food poisoning swept through the press plane. It was a disaster. So Bush's campaign made a rule. No more cheeseburgers on the plane. The press was baffled. They could eat anything else, just not cheeseburgers. Bush was serious about it. He thought the cheeseburgers were cursed or contaminated or something. The ban stayed in effect throughout the campaign. Reporters joked about it, wrote stories about the Great Cheeseburger Ban of 2000. Bush didn't care. He wasn't going to let bad beef ruin his campaign. It's such a strange, specific policy. Most campaigns worry about message discipline and swing states. Bush's campaign also worried about sandwich related illness, but at least Bush's food concerns were practical, unlike his successor's relationship with sports brackets. Barack Obama filled out NCAA basketball brackets on live television. Every March, ESPN would broadcast Obama making his picks for March Madness. They called it Barack-atology. Obama took it seriously. He'd study teams, watch games, analyze stats. His picks were usually pretty good. He'd predict upsets, explain his reasoning, get into detailed analysis of matchups. The bracket segments became an annual tradition. Critics said it was beneath presidential dignity. Obama supporters said it made him relatable. Obama clearly enjoyed it. Basketball was his game, had been since high school. The brackets let him talk sports, be a regular person for 20 minutes. His predictions weren't always accurate, but they were genuinely his picks, not staff suggestions. Obama filled out those brackets himself, often going against conventional wisdom. It was a small, humanizing tradition in an increasingly polarized political environment. The next president had very different concerns about his public image, particularly regarding his hair. Donald Trump's hair is real, not a toupee, not a wig. It's his actual hair, just styled in a very specific, elaborate way. Trump has described his hair routine in interviews. He grows the front long, the sides long, combs it all back and forward in an intricate pattern. The comb-over technique he uses is apparently something he's perfected over decades. There were rumors he patented a specific combing method, though this isn't quite accurate. What is true, Trump has been defensive about his hair for years. He's let people pull on it to prove it's real. He's explained his washing and styling routine in detail. The hair has become iconic, instantly recognizable, frequently mocked. But it's authentic Trump hair, grown from his head, just arranged in a way that defies both gravity and conventional grooming. It's a small thing, but it represents Trump's approach to many things, doing exactly what he wants regardless of what people think looks normal. But speaking of historical traditions, let's return to some earlier presidential drinking habits. George Washington's favorite drink was fish house punch, not the watered-down version with rum in his coffee. The real thing. Fish house punch was a colonial-era cocktail. Rum, cognac, peach brandy, lemon juice, sugar, and water. Served in large bowls at parties, incredibly strong. One bowl could incapacitate a dozen men. Washington loved it. Served it at Mount Vernon, at parties, at military celebrations. There are records of Washington ordering the ingredients in bulk. The punch was sweet, fruity, and absolutely lethal. You'd drink it thinking it tasted fine, then stand up and realize you couldn't walk. Washington, who could hold his liquor better than most, would drink fish house punch and remain functional while everyone around him collapsed. The recipe still exists. People make it today for historical reenactments. It's just as strong now as it was then. Washington's farewell parties allegedly involved enough fish house punch to affect attendance at morning meetings the next day. But while Washington knew how to party, his successor's final moments were tragically poetic. John Adams' last words were, "Thomas Jefferson survives." He died on July 4th, 1826, 50 years exactly after the Declaration of Independence. Adams spent his final morning thinking about the anniversary, about the nation he'd helped create, about his old friend and rival Jefferson. As Adams was dying, he said, "Jefferson survives," finding comfort in the idea that his friend was still alive. But Jefferson had died earlier that same day, 5 hours earlier, at Monticello. Jefferson's last words were reportedly, "Is it the 4th?" Both men, the second and third presidents, died on the 50th anniversary of American independence, within hours of each other. The coincidence is so perfect, it seems fictional. Adams died not knowing Jefferson was already gone. He spent his last conscious moments believing Jefferson lived. It's heartbreaking and beautiful. Two founders, complicated friends, bitter rivals, united in death on the most symbolically perfect day possible. But while Adams died thinking Jefferson was fine, Jefferson himself died in financial ruin. Thomas Jefferson died bankrupt. He'd been financially struggling for years, spent money constantly on books, wine, improvements to Monticello, maintaining his lifestyle. Jefferson's farms weren't profitable. He had massive debts. When he died on July 4th, 1826, his estate was deeply insolvent. His family had to sell almost everything. Monticello, the house Jefferson designed and loved, was sold. His possessions were auctioned. But the worst part, his personal library. Jefferson had one of the finest book collections in America, thousands of volumes, many rare. He'd already sold one library to Congress in 1815 to help found the Library of Congress, but he'd built another collection. After his death, it was sold to pay creditors. Books scattered everywhere, many lost to history. Jefferson spent his life building America and building his library, and died watching both slip away from his family. It's a cautionary tale about lifestyle inflation and poor financial planning, but at least his daughter got one moment of White House glory before the end. James Monroe's daughter Maria was the first person to be married in the White House, March 9th, 1820. Maria Hester Monroe married Samuel Gouverneur in what was then called the President's House. She was 17. It was a small, private ceremony. Only immediate family and close friends. Monroe didn't want a big public affair. The wedding was in the Blue Room. Maria wore white, which was just becoming fashionable for brides. After the ceremony, there was a small reception. That was it. The first White House wedding, and it was relatively modest. Later presidential children would have much more elaborate weddings, but Maria and Samuel were happy. They stayed married until Maria died in 1850. The wedding started a tradition. Many presidential children and relatives would marry at the White House over the following 2 centuries. But Maria was first, setting the precedent in a quiet ceremony while her father was president. And speaking of precedents, one president's family tree stretches far further than seems possible. John Tyler's grandson was still alive as of 2024. Let that sink in. Tyler was born in 1790. He was president in the 1840s. His son, Lyon Gardner Tyler, was born in 1853 when Tyler was 63. Lyon had a son, Harrison Ruffin Tyler, born in 1928 when Lyon was 75. Harrison is John Tyler's grandson, 2 generations connecting 1790 to the 21st century. Harrison Tyler lived to see the internet, smartphones, social media. His grandfather was born during George Washington's presidency. The math barely works, but it does. Both Tyler men had children very late in life, extending the generational gap. Harrison gave interviews about his grandfather, sharing stories passed down through only one intermediary. It's the closest thing to time travel we have. A direct genetic and oral link from the early republic to modern America. 3 lifetimes spanning almost all of American history. And that's where we are now, connected to the past in ways that seem impossible. Zachary Taylor kept his horse, Old Whitey, grazing on the White House lawn. The horse had been with Taylor through the Mexican-American War, battle-tested, calm under fire, and apparently very comfortable eating White House grass. Old Whitey lived on the grounds during Taylor's brief presidency, from March 1849 until Taylor's death in July 1850. The horse was a celebrity. Visitors would see Old Whitey grazing and stop to pet him. People plucked hairs from his tail as souvenirs so aggressively that Old Whitey's tail became noticeably thinner. Taylor didn't mind. He loved that horse. When Taylor died, Old Whitey walked in the funeral procession, boots reversed in the stirrups, according to military tradition. The horse was reportedly agitated, sensing something was wrong. After the funeral, Old Whitey was retired to a pasture where he lived several more years. He was the last war horse to live at the White House, a living reminder of Taylor's military career. But while Taylor brought books of war experience, his successor found the White House intellectually barren. Millard Fillmore discovered the White House had 0 books when he moved in. No library, no collection, nothing. Previous presidents had brought their own books and taken them when they left. Fillmore thought this was ridiculous. The White House should have a permanent library. So he and his wife Abigail started one. They requested funds from Congress, received an appropriation of $2,000, a substantial sum in 1851. Abigail selected the books herself: history, literature, reference works, contemporary novels. She had bookshelves built in the upstairs Oval Room. Created the first permanent White House library. It started with a few hundred volumes. Later presidents added to it. Now the White House has several libraries with thousands of books, but Fillmore and Abigail started it from nothing, recognizing that the president's home should be a place of learning. It's perhaps Fillmore's most lasting contribution. A quiet legacy. He gave the White House books. Though the next president's legacy was considerably darker despite his literary inaugural display. Franklin Pierce ran over a woman with his horse in 1853 while serving as president. We mentioned this earlier, but it bears repeating because no charges were filed. The woman, Mrs. Nathan Lewis, was crossing the street. Pierce was riding too fast, didn't see her in time, knocked her down with his horse. She survived with injuries. A police officer arrested Pierce at the scene, but the case was dismissed. Pierce was the sitting president. Prosecuting him seemed legally complicated. Mrs. Lewis reportedly didn't push the matter. Maybe she was intimidated. Maybe she was paid off. Historical records aren't clear, but Pierce literally got away with running someone over because of his position. It's a stark reminder that presidential power included immunity from consequence, formal or informal. Pierce's presidency was already troubled. Heavy drinking, grief over his son's death, political failures. The horse incident just added another layer of tragedy and injustice. But at least Pierce's end wasn't foreseen, unlike the premonition that haunted the next president. Abraham Lincoln dreamed of his own assassination 2 weeks before it happened. He told several people about it, including his wife Mary and his friend Ward Hill Lemon. In the dream, Lincoln walked through the White House hearing people weeping. He searched for the source, found a corpse in the East Room surrounded by mourners. Lincoln asked a soldier who had died. The soldier replied, "The president. He was killed by an assassin." Lincoln saw his own body lying in state. He woke up disturbed, told Lamon the dream bothered him deeply. Lamon urged Lincoln to be more careful, to increase security. Lincoln dismissed the concerns, said if someone wanted to kill him badly enough, they'd find a way. 2 weeks later, April 14th, 1865, John Wilkes Booth shot Lincoln at Ford's Theater. Lincoln died the next morning. His body lay in state in the East Room, exactly as in the dream. Whether it was premonition, anxiety, or a terrible coincidence, Lincoln saw his own death coming and couldn't stop it. His successor faced different legal troubles, though less metaphysically disturbing. Ulysses S. Grant was ticketed for speeding at 20 miles per hour. In a horse and carriage. 20 miles per hour doesn't sound fast now, but in 1872 on Washington, D.C. streets, it was reckless. The speed limit was probably around 10 miles per hour. Grant was driving his carriage fast, liked the speed, liked feeling in control of something after years of military command. Officer William West pulled him over at the corner of 13th and M Streets. Grant knew he was guilty, handed over a $20 fine without argument. The officer reportedly apologized for having to ticket the president. Grant said no apology necessary. The law was the law, Grant paid the fine, and that was that. There's something admirable about Grant's acceptance. He didn't pull rank, didn't claim presidential immunity, just paid his fine and moved on. It's a small moment of integrity in a presidency that was otherwise plagued by scandals from his cabinet members, though not from Grant himself personally. The next president understood personal loss that shaped his entire administration. Chester Arthur's sister Mary served as First Lady because Arthur's wife died before he became president. Ellen Arthur died of pneumonia in January 1880, more than a year before Arthur became president, following Garfield's assassination. Arthur was devastated. He never remarried, never fully recovered from losing Ellen. When he suddenly became president in September 1881, he had no First Lady, so his youngest sister, Mary Arthur McElroy, agreed to serve as White House hostess. Mary was married, had her own family, but came to Washington to help her brother. She hosted dinners, receptions, state functions, did all the social duties expected of a First Lady. Mary served in this role throughout Arthur's term, balancing her responsibilities with her own family life. Arthur kept a fresh bouquet of flowers in front of Ellen's portrait every single day he was president. Never stopped mourning. Mary understood her brother's grief and helped him maintain the dignity of the office despite it. But while Arthur grieved privately, the next president had surprisingly casual phone manners. Grover Cleveland answered the White House telephone by saying, "What is it?" Not "hello," not "this is the president," just "what is it?" Gruff, direct, slightly irritated. That was Cleveland's phone manner. The telephone was still relatively new technology in the 1880s and 90s. Cleveland treated it like an interruption, which it often was. He'd be working on something important. The phone would ring. He'd answer with, "What is it?" expecting whoever was calling to quickly explain themselves. Staff found this amusing. Visitors calling the White House were often startled by the president's bluntness. Cleveland didn't care. He wasn't there to make small talk on the telephone. He had work to do. If you were calling, you'd better have a good reason. It's such a perfect encapsulation of Cleveland's personality. Serious, no nonsense, mildly grumpy. The phone was a tool, not a social device. What is it? Perfect. The next president, however, faced his end with considerably more grace and piety. William McKinley's last words were, "Nearer, my God, to thee." He was dying from the assassin's bullet, September 14th, 1901. McKinley had been shot 8 days earlier by Leon Czolgosz. Gangrene set in. McKinley knew he was dying. As he faded, surrounded by his wife Ida and close friends, McKinley began reciting his favorite hymn, "Nearer, my God, to thee, nearer to thee, even though it be a cross that raiseth me." He managed several lines before losing consciousness. McKinley died early morning on September 14th. He was 58 years old. The hymn he quoted is about accepting suffering and death as a path closer to God. It was later famously associated with the Titanic sinking, but McKinley said it first in this context, facing his own death with faith and dignity. Whether you're religious or not, there's something profound about a man choosing his last words to be a prayer. His successor, Theodore Roosevelt, brought very different energy to the office, particularly regarding his voracious reading habits. Theodore Roosevelt read one book a day, every day, even while serving as president, sometimes more than one if they were short. Roosevelt was a speed reader, could absorb information incredibly quickly. He'd read at breakfast, during brief breaks, before bed. History, science, literature, poetry, military strategy. Roosevelt consumed books constantly. He'd finish a novel in an evening, read a biography over breakfast, tear through a collection of essays during lunch. His personal library at Sagamore Hill contained thousands of books. Roosevelt read them all, many multiple times. He could quote long passages from memory, discuss obscure historical details. reference scientific papers years after reading them. When people visited Roosevelt, they were often astonished by his knowledge base. It came from reading constantly, obsessively, joyfully. Roosevelt believed reading made him a better president, a better person. He wrote letters to authors, discussed books with everyone he met. Reading was as essential to him as breathing. But while Roosevelt loved literature, his successor found his true calling after the presidency ended. William Howard Taft became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court after his presidency. He's the only president to do so. Taft left office in 1913 after losing to Woodrow Wilson. He practiced law, taught at Yale, served on various boards, but Taft's dream was always to be on the Supreme Court. In 1921, President Warren Harding appointed Taft as Chief Justice. Taft was thrilled. Later said being Chief Justice was more fulfilling than being president. He served until 1930, 9 years. Taft was a good Chief Justice, efficient, collaborative, well-liked by other justices. He helped modernize the court's procedures, advocated for a separate Supreme Court building. Taft died in 1930, shortly after retiring from the court. At his funeral, people noted he seemed more at peace than during his presidency. He'd found his true calling. The presidency was an interlude. The Supreme Court was his home. And with that, we've covered a century of presidential peculiarities, from Washington's rum-spiked coffee to Taft's judicial robes. We've covered presidents who got arrested, presidents who got stuck in bathtubs, presidents who spoke Mandarin to keep secrets, and presidents who just really, really hated broccoli. We've seen parrot profanity at funerals, bathtub alligators as diplomatic gifts, and a man who filed the nation's most important documents inside his extremely tall hat. And somehow, despite all of this, the cursing parrots and the toilet meetings and the squirrel wars and the secret yacht surgeries, somehow the country kept going. Democracy survived presidents who lost the White House china and poker games. The Republic endured leaders who rang bells just to watch servants scramble. We made it through administrations run by grief-stricken widows and sustained by jelly beans. History is strange. Presidents are a stranger. And if nothing else, you can sleep tonight knowing that whatever weird thing you did today, you probably didn't chase your Treasury Secretary through the White House with fire tongs, so you're doing better than James Monroe. The past is full of people who were just as confused, flawed, and occasionally ridiculous as we are. They just happened to do it while running a country. So rest well. Dream of mechanical horses and solar-powered White Houses. And remember, somewhere in history, a president got a speeding ticket in a horse-drawn carriage and paid it without complaint. If Ulysses S. Grant can accept his mistakes with grace, maybe we can too. Sleep tight. And thanks for spending 2 hours with 45 dead presidents and one very tired narrator. Good night.